The Education of Little Tree by Forrest Carter. Church Going, page 843. Grandpa said that preachers got so taken up with themselves that they got the notion they personally held the door handle on the pearly gates and wouldn't let nobody in without their say-so. Grandpa figured the preachers thought God didn't have nothing at all to do with it. He said a preacher had ought to work and get to know how hard a dollar was come by. Then he wouldn't throw money around like its use was going to end tomorrow. Grandpa said that good hard work, whether it was in the whiskey trade or whatever, would keep a preacher out of mischief, which sounds reasonable. People being so scattered, there was not enough to keep more than one church going. This led to some complications because there was so many different kinds of religion. Folks believe in so many different things that it made for disagreements. There was hard-shell Baptists who believed that what was going to happen and there was nothing you could do about it. There was Scott Presbyterians who would get stomping mad at such a notion. Each bunch could totally prove out their viewpoint by the Bible, which led to confusion as far as I was concerned as to what the Bible was talking about. Primitive Baptists believe in taking up a love offering of money for the preacher, and the Hardshells did not believe in paying a preacher anything. Grandpa leaned toward the Hardshells on this point. All the Baptists believed in baptizing, that is, getting total sunk under the waters in a creek. They said you could not be saved without it. The Methodists said that was wrong, that sprinkling on top of the head with water done the trick. They would each one whip out their Bibles there in the churchyard to prove out what they said. It appeared like the Bible told it both ways. But each time it told it, it cautioned you had better not do it the other way or you would go to hell. Or that's what they said. One feller was of the Church of Christ. He said if you called the preacher reverend, that you would flat go to hell. He said you could call him Mr. or brother, but you had better not call him reverend. He had him a place in the Bible to prove it out. But a bunch of others proved out also in the Bible that you had better call him reverend, or you would sure enough go to hell. The Church of Christ feller was bad outnumbered and got hollered down, but he was stubborn and would not give it up. He made it a point to walk up to the preacher every Sunday morning and call him Mr. This led to hard feelings twixt him and the preacher. Once they nearly come to blows in the churchyard, but was separated. I determined that I was not going to have anything at all to do with water around religion, and I was not going to call the preacher anything. I told Grandpa it appeared to be more than likely the safest thing to do, as you can easy get shipped down to hell depending on how the Bible was thinking at the time. Grandpa said if God was as narrow-headed as them idiots that done the arguing about piddling such, then heaven wouldn't be a fit place to live anyhow, which sounds reasonable. There was one family of Episcopalians. They was rich. They come to church in a car. It was the only car in the churchyard. The man was fat and wore a different suit might near every Sunday. The woman wore big hats. She was fat too. They had a little girl who always wore white dresses and little hats. She looked up all the time at something, though I could never determine what she was looking at. They always put $1 in the collection plate. It was the only one in the plate every Sunday. The preacher met them at their car door and opened it for them. They sat in the front row. The preacher would be preaching. He would make a point and look over at the front row and say, "Ain't that right, Mr. Johnson?" And Mr. Johnson would give a little jerk of his head, certifying more or less that it was a fact. Everybody would look over to get Mr. Johnson's head jerk and then settle back, satisfied as it was so. Grandpa said he reckoned Episcopalians had a total know-how on the entire thing and didn't have to wallow around on the fringes worrying about water and such. He said they knowed where they was going and was closed-mouthed about letting anybody else get in on it. The preacher was a skinny man. He wore the same black suit every Sunday. His hair stuck out on all sides, and he had the appearance of being nervous all the time, which he was. He is friendly to folks in the churchyard, though I never went up to him, but when he got in total control, standing in the pulpit, he got mean. Grandpa said this was because he knowed it was again the rules for anybody to jump up and challenge him while he was preaching. He never said anything about water, which was disappointing. I was interested in finding out the way you had better not use it, but he laid it heavy on the Pharisees. He would get to working up on the Pharisees and come down out of the pulpit and run up the aisle toward us. Sometimes he would might near lose his breath, he got so mad at them. One time he was giving the Pharisees hell and had come down the aisle. He'd holler about them and suck in his breath so hard his throat would rattle. He run down close to where we was a-settin' and pointed his finger at me and Grandpa and said, "You know what they was up to." It appeared like he was accusing me and Grandpa of having something to do with the Pharisees. Grandpa sat up in his seat and gave the preacher a hard look. Willa John looked toward him and Grandma held his arm. The preacher turned off to pointing at somebody else. Grandpa said he had never knowed any Pharisees and was not going to have any son of a bitch accusing him of having knowledge of nothing they had done. Grandpa said the preacher had better commence to point his finger somewhere else, which after that he did. I reckon he saw the look in Grandpa's eye. Willa John said the preacher was crazy and would bear close watching. Willa John always carried a long knife. The preacher also had a total disliking for Philistines. He was continual raking them up one side and down the other. He said they was more or less as low down as the Pharisees, which Mr. Johnson nodded his head that it was so. Grandpa said he got tired of hearing the preacher raking somebody over all the time. He said he didn't see any earthly reason for getting the Pharisees and the Philistines stirred up. There was enough trouble as it was. Grandpa always put something in the collection plate, though he disagreed with paying preachers. He said it paid the rent on our bench, he reckoned. Sometimes he'd give me a nickel that I could put in. Grandpa never put anything in, and Willa John would not look at the collection plate when they passed it. Grandpa said if they kept continually sticking the collection plate under Willa John's nose, that Willa John would take something out of it, figuring they was continually offering him some of it. Once a month there was testifying time. This is when people would stand up one by one and tell how much they loved the Lord and what all bad they had done. And Grandpa would never do it. He said all it done was cause trouble. He said he knew personal of several men who had been shot afterward when they had told something they had done to a feller, and the feller hadn't knowed about it until he heard tell of it from the church. Grandpa said such wasn't any business but his own. Grandma and Willa John didn't stand up. I told Grandpa I felt more or less like he did about it and was not going to stand up neither. One man said he was saved. He said he was going to stop liquoring up. Said he had been liquoring around fairly heavy for a number of years and now was not going to do it anymore, which made everybody feel good. Him trying to better himself. People shouted, "Praise the Lord and amen." Every time somebody got up and started telling the bad things he had done, a man over in a corner would always holler, "Tell it all, tell it all." He would keep this up every time it appeared they was going to stop, and they would try to think of something else bad they had done. Sometimes they come out with some pretty bad things which they might not have done if the man had not been hollering. He never did stand up. One time a woman stood up. She said the Lord had saved her from wicked ways. The man in the corner hollered, "Tell it all." Her face turned red and she said she had been fornicating. She said she was going to stop. She said it was not right. The man hollered, "Tell it all." She said she had done some fornicating with Mr. Smith. There was a commotion while Mr. Smith dissociated himself from the bench he was on and come walking down the aisle. He walked real fast and went out the church door. About that time, two fellers on a back bench got up and eased out the door without hardly any commotion at all. She called out 2 more names with which she had done some fornicating. Everybody was praising her and telling her she had done right. When we left the church house, the men all walked wide around that woman and would not speak to her. Grandpa said they was scared to be seen talking to her. Some of the women folks, however, crowded around her and beat her on the back and patted her and told her she had done the right thing. Grandpa said these was women who was wanting to know about their own men folks, and they figured if they showed how comforting it was to talk and how good you got treated by talking, they could get some more fornicating women to testify. Grandpa said if they did, it would be a hell of a mess, which it would. Grandpa said he hoped the woman didn't change her mind and decide to go back to fornicating. He said she would be in for a disappointment. He said she would not find anybody hardly at all to fornicate with less than he was drunk and out of his senses. Every Sunday before preaching started, there was a special time set aside when anybody could stand up and tell about folks who needed help. Sometimes it would be a sharecropper between movings who didn't have anything to eat for his family, or somebody whose house had burned down. All the people in the church would bring things to help. We always carried a lot of vegetables in the summertime, which we had plenty of. In the winter, we'd carry meat. One time, Grandpa made a hickory limb chair and seated it with striped deer hide for a family that had lost their furniture in a fire. Grandpa taken the man aside there in the churchyard and give him the chair and spent a long time showing him how to make it. Grandpa said if you showed a feller how to do, it was a lot better than giving him something. He said if you learnt a man to make for himself, then he would be all right. But if you just give him something and didn't learn him anything, then you would be continual giving to the man the rest of your natural life. Grandpa said you would be doing the man a disservice, for if he become dependent on you, then you taken away his character and had stole it from him. Grandpa said some folks like to just continually give because it made them feel uppity and better than the feller they was given to, when all they had to do was learn the feller a little something which would make him dependent on himself. Grandpa said human nature being what it was, there was some fellers found out that some people liked to feel uppity. He said these fellers got to be such sorry men that they was anybody's dog that would hunt them. They got down to where they would rather be a hound to Mr. Uppitys than to be their own man. He said they continually whined about what they needed when what they needed was some learning done by a hard boot stuck in their backsides. Grandpa said some nations was uppity in the same way and would give so they could call themselves big shots, when if they had their heart in the right place, would learn the people to who they was given how to do for themselves. Grandpa said these nations wouldn't do this because then the other people would not be dependent on them, and that's what they was after in the first place. Me and Grandpa was creek washing when he got to talking about it. He got worked up on the whole thing, and we had to crawl out on the bank or he would more than likely have drowned in the waters. I asked Grandpa who was Moses. Grandpa said he had never got a right clear picture of Moses. What the preacher, sucking air and rattling and hollering, the preacher said Moses was a disciple. Grandpa cautioned me not to take his word as bound oath because he couldn't tell me anything except what he had heard about Moses. He said Moses taken up with a girl in some bulrush reeds, which he understood growed on the riverbank. He said this was natural, but the girl was rich, and as a matter of fact belonged to a mean son of a bitch called Pharaoh. He said Pharaoh was always a-killing people. Pharaoh got it in for Moses more than likely on account of the girl, which causes some trouble today. Grandpa said Moses hid out and taken the people with him that Pharaoh was trying to kill. He said Moses headed out into a country that didn't have no water in it, and Moses taken a stick and hit a rock and some water come out. Grandpa said he had no notion at all how he done it, but that is what he had heard. Grandpa said Moses wandered around for years with no idea whatsoever as to where he was going. As a matter of fact, he never did get there, but the people that kept following him around did get there. Wherever it was, they was going. He said Moses died while he was still wandering around. Grandpa said Samson come in there somewheres and killed a lot of Philistines who was always making trouble. He said he didn't know what the fight was about or if the Philistines was Pharaoh's men or not. Grandpa said a conniving woman got Samson drunk and cut his hair off. He said the woman fixed Samson so his enemies could get at him. Grandpa couldn't recollect the woman's name, but he said it was a good Bible lesson, that you was to watch out for conniving women who tried to get you drunk, which I said I would. Grandpa taken great satisfaction from learning me that Bible lesson. It is more than likely the only one he had ever learnt anybody. Looking back on it, me and Grandpa was pretty ignorant of the Bible, and I guess confused as to all the technical ways by which you got to heaven. Me and Grandpa more or less figured we was out of the whole thing technical-wise, for we never could get it reasoned out to make any sense at all. Once you give up on something, then you are kind of an onlooker. Me and Grandpa was onlookers when it come to technical church religion, and had no anxious feeling about it at all, as we had give it up. Grandpa said I had just as well forget about the water situation. He said he had totally give up on it a long time ago and felt better since that time. He said privately speaking, couldn't reason as to what in the hell water had to do with it. I felt the same way, and so give up on it on the water too. End of chapter.